morning. We left off in Night of the Spadefoot Toads where Ben had a dilemma. He had to choose between going to Danny's party or going and helping Mrs. Tibbetts on a Saturday. And due to the way that Danny treated him at the lunch table, he decided he didn't really want to go to Danny's party. But the only problem was he had told Ryan that he was going to go. And he's not yet told Ryan that he's not going. So he's a little worried that Ryan's going to be upset because he didn't let him know he wasn't coming. So let's read chapter 6 and see what happens. Ben opens the front door the moment the bell rings. His mom comes up behind him in the doorway. Mrs. Tibbetts is dressed in old jeans, a brown canvas jacket, and the same leather hiking boots she wears at school. "Hello, Ben. You must be Mrs. Maroney. I'm Gloria Tibbetts." She holds out her hand. "I'm so happy you called," his mom says as she shakes the teacher's hand. "Would you like me to pick him up?" "Oh, no, the teacher says. "I'll bring him back right after we get the work done and have a bite to eat." Mrs. Tibbetts' car is a beat-up old station wagon. Ben has trouble getting the passenger door open until Mrs. Tibbetts opens it from the inside. "Darn door," she says. "I don't use it much." Inside, the car is like a storage shed that hasn't been cleaned out for a long time. The back seat is folded down to make more room for all the stacked up boxes and plastic containers. Boots and raincoats are piled on top of the boxes. Spades and shovels and nets like the ones used for hauling in fish after they're caught have been thrown in anywhere they'll fit. Mrs. Tibbetts gathers the books and papers from the passenger seat and crams them between two boxes in the back. "There, this'll do for now," she says. "But I need to clean this car out in the worst way. It's worse than my desk, worse than my brain." She laughs an easy, comfortable laugh. Ben doesn't mind the mess. He looks in the back seat, remembering Mr. Tompkins at the Desert Museum and all the equipment that people there used. While he's looking, Mrs. Tibbetts keeps talking. "I really appreciate your help today. I know kids don't like to give up their Saturdays, but I have to move some things around in the yard, and I just can't do it all by myself. You'll see. Hopefully no one will bother us and we can get some work done." Mrs. Tibbetts checks the rearview mirror and backs out of his driveway. "You can open the window if you want." Ben rolls the window down. The air is warm and the sun is shining. There aren't any leaves on the trees yet, but it feels like things are coming back to life. He looks over at Mrs. Tibbetts as she drives. He's never ridden in a teacher's car before, let alone been to a teacher's house. "Will your husband be there to help too?" he asks. Mrs. Tibbetts keeps her eyes on the road. "My husband died last year, so I'm afraid he won't be much help today. If he could, he would. He loved being outdoors." Ben swallows. He feels horrible. He should have figured that out by himself. That's why she left school for a while. He fumbles for something to say, but Mrs. Tibbetts keeps talking. "I really do need help. That's why I asked. And it sounds like you enjoy being outside." Ben nods. "In Tucson, I spend a lot of time outdoors. A lot by myself, and with my friend Toby." It's Mrs. Tibbetts' turn to nod. It strikes Ben that they're both talking about someone they've lost, though moving away from your best friend is nothing like losing someone you're married to. He sneaks another look at Mrs. Tibbetts. Maybe that's why her eyes look sad, even when she laughs. She keeps looking straight ahead. He can't think of anything else to say. You live pretty close to me as the crow flies," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Those woods behind your house connect to the woods behind mine, although it would be hard to find your way through. But I have lots of frogs on my property too, several kinds." It's better when she's doing all the talking, Ben thinks. She goes on. "American toads will be coming out pretty soon, and even some Spadefoots." Spadefoots? Ben had heard of Spadefoots, but he doesn't know much about them. "Right," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Eastern Spadefoots. They're very rare around here. This is as far north as they go, or as they get. But we've got some." She turns off the main road and onto a winding street. They drive past a wooded lot with no houses and pull into a driveway. He peers out the car window. The little house is set away back from the street. There's hardly any lawn. Instead, there are bushes and trees and large flower beds covered with straw. The car comes to a stop and Ben gets out. He sees a one-car garage to his left connected to the house by a covered walkway. A couple of bare, gnarled trees loom over the front porch. "Looks like a pretty old house," Ben says. "The oldest part is 140 years old," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Almost older than me." Ben looks at her. "That's a joke," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Come around back and I'll show you what to do." They walk to the back of the house. It faces south, so the morning sun is reflecting off the window panes. The backyard stretches out into a meadow of tall, uncut, tawny grass, with woods at the far end. Small trees and bushes are arranged in rough lines over part of the meadow. Just beyond the garage, Ben sees what looks like a fenced-in vegetable garden with piles of brush and weeds and heaped nearby. Off to the left, a hill rises steeply with a bare outcropping of rocks crowning its top. It looks like a great place to explore. As if reading his mind, Mrs. Tibbetts says, "Want to look around a bit before we get to work?" "Sure." He follows his teacher out to the middle of the field, and they stop and stand by the rows of bushes. "These are blueberries," Mrs. Tibbetts says, fingering one of the bare branches. "The birds get most of them." "Is this all your land?" Ben asks. "Yes," she says. "Well, mine and my sister-in-law's." Ben looks back at the house. There's a big tool shed behind the garage. "Is this a farm or something?" he asks. "It was, once upon a time. My husband's father farmed it, and his father did too. They weren't serious farmers. It's hard to farm here because the soil is very rocky. A lot of the fields have gone back to woods now. Anyway, Thomas inherited the house and the land right around it. It's where he grew up. He loves it here." Ben notices a little lean-to against this tool shed. A large cage up on legs sits under the lean-to roof. It looks like a rabbit hutch. "What's that?" he asks, pointing. Mrs. Tibbetts shakes her head and says, "It's a snake cage." Ben's ears perk up. "Are there snakes in there?" "Yes, my husband kept them." "What kind?" "It doesn't matter," Mrs. Tibbetts said. "You must leave them alone and not go near them." "But are they—" "I'm dead serious. Don't go near the cage. Do you understand me?" Ben nods. He can tell she doesn't want to talk about it anymore. It only makes him more curious. "Let's get to work," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "So we'll have time later to look for frogs." Mrs. Tibbetts opens the door of the tool shed. "Wait here. I need to get a few things." Ben can't help staring at the cages. What could be in there? Mrs. Tibbetts hands Ben a rake and a big plastic tarp and leads him around to a large flower bed on the side of the house away from the garage. She instructs him to rake the leaves out of the bed and pile them up on the tarp. Ben leaves him there to work in the sun. Soon, he's sweating. Just as he's finishing with the beds, she reappears and points out a pile of fallen branches. "I want you to drag those limbs out to the back part of the field. Cover for animals," she says. "A place they can hide from hawks." Ben can't remember the last time he worked this hard, but the morning goes by quickly. When he's moved all the branches out of the field, he sits on the rock wall and enjoys the sun for a minute. He's still breathing heavily, but a light breeze cools his face. Now that he's still, he can hear birds singing. "All done?" Mrs. Tibbetts calls. She has something that looks like a deflated inner tube draped over her shoulders. "I think so," Ben answers. "Let's go for a walk then," she says, and holds up a really long pair of boots. "We'll take these hip waders in case we want to wade in some muck." Ben has seen pictures of boots like these, but he's never worn any. He puts a pair over his shoulder and follows Mrs. Tibbetts. She stops at the edge of the woods and points to an opening in the trees. "My husband made this trail years ago. It loops back around through the woods in a big circle and comes out near the garage," she says, then heads off down the trail at a quick pace. Before Ben knows it, Mrs. Tibbetts is down the path almost 20 yards ahead of him. Ben struggles along, lugging the big boots, following the faint trail. He pushes past a tangle of briars and fallen tree branches and nearly steps on Mrs. Tibbetts, who is kneeling by a log. She lifts it up slightly. "Look," she says. Ben squats beside her. Huddled under the log is a little squirmy thing, a couple of inches long with legs and a tail. It has yellow spots up and down its back. Ben gets down on his knees right by Mrs. Tibbetts. "What is it?" "A yellow spotted salamander. It's just waking up now." Ben is impressed. "How'd you know it was there?" "Well, I wasn't sure, but they like moist places, and they usually burrow around roots, so I made an educated guess." She seems to know something about everything on this trail. She brushes back leaves and shows him where tiny white wildflowers called bloodroot are already blooming. She stops in front of the tree and breaks off a twig. "Chew on the end of it," she says. Ben bites down on the twig, and his mouth fills with a sudden sweetness. "It tastes sort of minty." "Black birch," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "People use it to make root beer. It's also got a natural painkiller in it." Ben had never thought of root beer coming from an actual plant before. Mrs. Tibbetts heads farther down the trail, and he runs to keep up. When the path skirts a swampy area, Ben sees the bright green shoots of a plant sticking up and out of the marshy ground, like the ones behind his house. "What's that?" he asked. "Skunk cabbage." "Why do they call it that?" "Why do you think?" she asked. "Because skunks eat it?" "No," she said. "Because if you break the leaves, the smell is just horrible, like a skunk. Want me to pick some for you to sample?" "No thanks," Ben says. "I'll take your word for it." "Try to stand right behind me on the trail," Mrs. Tibbetts advises. "There are a lot of plants and critters here that wouldn't appreciate being squashed by our big feet." Ben follows her, stopping to marvel at everything she points out. This isn't the Sonoran Desert, of course, but it is about 100 times more interesting than he had expected. "You getting tired?" Mrs. Tibbetts looks back at him. "We've been at it for a while. We're looping back toward the house now." Ben shakes his head. He's lost track of time. "Well, we're nearly there, just beyond those red maples." She skirts around a clump of trees and stops in a clearing in the front of a pool of water about 20 feet across. The sun is glinting on the water. "Here it is," she says. "Here's what?" "Where the Spadefoot will be, in a month or so. It just looks like a big puddle." "It is, a special puddle called a vernal pool. Vernal means spring. The pool is only here in the spring, but a lot of things depend on it to live. Wood frogs, salamanders, fairy shrimp. Shrimp? Fairy shrimp, tiny crustaceans about an inch long, and spadefoots. They only breed on one night, the rainiest night in April, and then they're gone." "Where?" "Back underground. They're very private and only come out at night. The night they breed is about the only chance you have to see them. One night a year, and that's it. They're almost impossible to find. You can hear them, though, on that night." "Really?" "Oh, yes. They make quite a racket." She sits down on a large rock by the pool and takes off her shoes, then pulls on the wading boots. Ben does the same. They're way too big for him, and when he stands up, he loses his balance. "Ah!" he says, trying not to fall over, but he ends up sprawling in the wet muck at the edge of the pool. His hands are muddy, his forearms wet, and a rich, funky smell comes up from the muck. He tries to get up, but it's hard in the boots. He's on his hands and knees and feels stupid. He looks at Mrs. Tibbetts. She's laughing. "Oh, for Pete's sake," she says, "it's not a swimming pool." Something about the way she says it makes Ben laugh too. She reaches down a hand and pulls him up. His arms are smeared with wet mud. He rubs them on the front of his jacket. "You look like the creature from the Black Lagoon," Mrs. Tibbetts says. "Your mother will kill me." She hands him a bandana and he wipes the mud off his fingers. "At least my feet are dry," he says. Mrs. Tibbetts laughs again and wades out to the middle of the pool. Ben starts to follow. "Try not to stir things up," she says. She inches along, bending down and peering into the murky water, and Ben follows behind, feeling the cool of the water through the boots. Ben can't figure out what she's doing. "Do you see anything?" he asks. She doesn't answer. After several minutes, she says, "Look, over here." Ben wades over and she points at a gooey-looking blob floating in the pond. Inside the clear goo are hundreds of little black dots. What is it? Wood frog eggs. Like the one I caught? Who knows? Maybe she's the one that laid them. What are the black dots? The eggs. But there must be thousands of them. About that many, Mrs. Tibbetts says. Most of them won't make it. Why not? Because they taste so good. Yum, yum. At least to snakes. Ben stares at the massive eggs. Cool, he says. He shakes his head at himself. That sounded more like what Ryan would say. Very cool, Mrs. Tibbetts answers, and the Spadefoots are even cooler. They're my favorite. She stands up and rubs her back, stiff from leaning over. They wade out of the mucky water and put their shoes back on. It feels good to be back in sneakers. They sit on the rock for a little while. The sun warms Ben's back. It's nice here, he says. Yeah, very nice. Without another word, Mrs. Tibbetts gets up and heads down the path toward the house. Let's get some lunch, she calls back to him. Then I'll pay you and take you home. Ben had forgotten all about the money. He'd forgotten all about everything, even the birthday party. Okay, he says happily, hurrying to catch up, toting the wet boots over his shoulder. As they come to the side of the house by the garage, a fancy car pulls in the driveway, and a woman wearing an expensive-looking coat gets out. Her hair is bright red. Oh, for Pete's sake, Mrs. Tibbetts mutters. I wonder what she wants. Ben, why don't you find something to do in the backyard for a couple minutes while I talk to her? Ben looks at Mrs. Tibbetts. It's just Tabitha, my sister-in-law, she says with a frown on her face. Go on, it won't take long. There is no reason for you to have to talk to her. She takes Ben's boots and walks across the yard. Ben is happy for an excuse not to meet the red-headed woman. He can tell by the look on Mrs. Tibbetts' face that her sister-in-law isn't someone he really wants to meet. He's almost to the walkway between the house and garage when he hears their voices getting louder. At first, he can't really hear their words, but they both sound annoyed. He retraces his steps and stands behind the shrubs at the corner of the house. I know how you feel, Gloria, but it's really my decision. Ben can tell that it's the red-headed woman speaking. The words sound brittle, like they might break when they come out of her mouth. It's not what Thomas would have wanted, Mrs. Tibbetts says. I know very well what he wanted. He asked me to wait a year. He said not to do anything for at least a year, Mrs. Tibbetts says. I don't think he intended for you to sell, not like this anyway. And although you don't seem to care what I think, it's certainly not what I want. Ben feels sneaky, but he can't help listening. It's weird. Even though he doesn't know Mrs. Tibbetts all that well, something about her sharp-tongued sister-in-law alarms him. Really, Gloria, the other woman snaps, you're being pig-headed. It's best for both of us. 15 houses jammed up next to mine is not my idea of what's best for me. It won't be the same, and Thomas loved this land as it was, not with roads and houses. Oh, you act like they're going to put a nuclear waste dump here or something. Tabitha's voice sounds agitated now. I could stop this, Mrs. Tibbetts says. Don't you dare start with that again. The other woman snaps, her voice rising. I could, though. If you call the state about that, the woman sputters. Really, Gloria, this is not your decision in any way. You need the money more than I do. Look at the house. It needs painting. I know very well what it needs. I'm only trying to help. It's help I don't really want, Tabitha. Oh, it's not use trying to reason with you. You are so stubborn. No more than you, Mrs. Tibbetts says. There's a pause. Ben can feel his heart beating so loudly, he's afraid they're both going to hear it. The other woman speaks again. In the end, it's my decision. Legally, this is my land, and I'm going to get the best price for it I can. You'll get your share as Tom requested in his will, and then you can decide what you want to do with it. And remember, I don't legally owe you any more than that. I'm just honoring what my brother wanted. Ben can barely hear his teacher's response. Well, whatever you're going to do, you're going to do. I wish you wouldn't be like that. I'm afraid it's just the way I am. Come inside and I'll see if I can find the papers. Ben hears the front door close. Mrs. Tibbetts seems to have forgotten about him. He's breathing hard like he was in an argument himself. He wanders around back. He thinks about exploring the woods again, but he doesn't want to go too far away from the house in case Mrs. Tibbetts comes looking for him. He opens the door of the tool shed a crack and peers inside. Nothing but garden tools and a big pile of empty plant containers. Outside again, he wanders over to the back of the shed. The cage underneath the lean-to is partially hidden in the shadows. He edges closer. It's made of wood and wire tightly woven into half-inch squares. A plywood wall marks off a small corner of the cage. It looks like some kind of shelter area for a small creature. He tries to peer into the entrance, but it's just too dark. Don't go near the cage, Mrs. Tibbetts had said. What kind of snakes are in there? Ben shakes the cage a little to see if he can get anything to come out. There's no movement. Maybe there's nothing in there at all. But then, why did Mrs. Tibbetts tell him to stay away? Ben looks around on the ground and finds a skinny stick. He pushes the stick through the wire and into the hole in the nesting area. He twists and wiggles it gently inside the hole. Ben hears a car motor start up on the other side of the garage. He pulls the stick out of the flings and flings it on the ground. He runs around the side of the house and smacks into Mrs. Tibbetts, almost knocking her over. Oh, she says. Sorry, says Ben. What were you doing back there? Mrs. Tibbetts says. Her voice is tense. I was just walking around looking at stuff, Ben says. It's a horrible answer. You weren't bothering the snakes, were you? Ben shakes his head. No, I wasn't. He feels bad about lying, but nothing happened and he doesn't want her to be mad at him. You have to promise, Mrs. Tibbetts says. Don't go near the cage. She puts her hand to her chest like she's trying to calm down. She lets out a breath. I'm sorry if I yelled, but it's very important. They're not to be disturbed. Do you understand? Ben nods. Mrs. Tibbetts rubs her forehead. Then without words, she turns and heads toward the house. Ben follows her through the back door into the kitchen. It's a small room with a table just big enough for 2 chairs. A cardboard box overflowing with papers and files taking up most of the surface of the table. And 2 more boxes just like it are sitting on the floor. Sorry about all the mess, Mrs. Tibbetts says, not looking at him. I'm just going through some old things. She picks up one of the boxes and carries it out to some other room. Ben's heart is still pounding from his teacher's scolding. He looks at the box on the table. Balanced on top is a stack of black and white photographs. He sits in one of the chairs and leans in for a better look. Some of the pictures are yellowed and curled up on the edges. He guesses they're old, probably as old as the photos in his grandmother's family album. Ben listens for the sound of Mrs. Tibbetts' footsteps. He only hears a faint scraping in the back of the house. He takes a chance and flips through a few of the pictures. Groups of people, relatives probably, posing at holiday time or standing at the beach or leaning against old cars. Then one of the boy and girls catch his eyes. The boy looks like he's about 8 years old, younger than Ben is now, and the girl looks around 6. They're sitting on a large rock squinting into the sun. The boy, his face all scrunched up, is holding something away from himself, like he's not sure he really wants to touch it, but can't tell if he's laughing or upset. Maybe both. He peers at the object in the boy's hands. It looks like some sort of toad. The girl has something too. Her long curly hair hangs down over her shoulders, but Ben can see that she's holding an even fatter toad under her chin. She's laughing. He flips over the picture and sees someone has written in a kid's scrawl, Tom, me, and the overtoad. He looks at it again. He doesn't notice when Mrs. Tibbetts comes back in the room. That's Thomas, my husband. Startled, Ben drops the photo on the table. Who's the girl? He asks. It looks like Tabitha, she says, hurrying to the refrigerator. How does chicken salad sound to you? Fine, says Ben. Neither of them says much during lunch. Maybe I should have gone to the birthday party, Ben thinks. The walk in the woods was fun, but now everything feels strange. You did good work today, Mrs. Tibbetts says, handing him an envelope. Ben peers inside. $15. That's too much, he says. No, it's not. It's what you earned. Okay. Ben folds the envelope and puts it in his pocket. Thanks. With barely another word, Mrs. Tibbetts stacks the lunch dishes in the kitchen sink and leads him through the house, out the front door, and back to the car. As she drives him home, she hums to herself, letting her voice fill the space where there's no talking. When she stops the car in front of the house, Ben opens the car door to climb out. Ben? Yes? I'm sorry I yelled at you about the cage. It's okay. There are a couple snakes in that cage. I shouldn't have them there, really. My husband rescued them from an area being developed, and he was looking for a nature center that might take them. He was a real herpetologist. The things everyone else was afraid of, he loved. This was just before he died. It was very sudden. I shouldn't have kept them. I know I need to find a place for them. I just haven't gotten around to doing it. What kind of snakes? He asked. She ignores his question. You should never bother them. Do you understand? Ben nods again. So, enough of that, Mrs. Tibbetts says. Thanks for coming. I really needed your help. Ben smiles. He's glad she's not mad anymore. He hates it when adults are angry. He never knows what to do or say. It's okay. Thanks for everything. No, thank you. And maybe we could look for those Spadefoots when we get a good rain. Cool, he says. Where'd that come from, he wonders. Ryan again. Cool, Mrs. Tibbetts repeats. It sounds funny coming from her. Funny, but nice. All right, that was chapter 6.